Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you're at. As a natural extension to the supply chain topics that Natalie touched on, of course, we'll look at carrier limitations as a piece of that. Equally as important as getting the goods in and through the facilities is the process of getting them out and into the hands of the consumers. As everybody is aware, there was, the pandemic that occurred in the early part of 2020, while it didn't create this shift to e-commerce buying, there was an ongoing trend that was increasing that as time went by. It certainly escalated it and accelerated it beyond anybody's wildest imagination. The carriers were unprepared for it at the time. And we had several carriers say, we immediately went from doing a normal amount of volume for this time of year to handling an entire peak in every day of the operation. So if you kind of put that into perspective and you say, all right, a normal peak, if the peak period was on a treadmill, you would be straddling the treadmill, you'd turn the treadmill on, you would step onto it gradually and increase the speed. And that's kind of how a normal peak would operate. This was more like having your treadmill set at the max speed and standing on the belt when you turned it on and trying to get your feet to catch up with the speed of the belt. I'm speaking of this because I've done that. I don't know why, but I did. But in any event, that's what it was like for these carriers, and it was difficult for them to get that going. Spring was typically a time of year where new contract negotiations and things like that would be occurring to prepare for the upcoming peak. All of those, big carriers started to throw those out and indeed started to look at taking existing relationships and altering those in ways that had been unseen in the past. We came through that, and this still continues to this day. The large carriers continue to constrain shippers, particularly enterprise level shippers, with selective parcel handling. That's really focusing on a typical package or a certain type of package that's easy to handle, and anything else that's larger or out of that scope can either be cut from the program, or there's significant surcharges that would apply to handling those types of shipments. Other things that were in place were volume caps and significant surcharges, both peak and non-peak. Some of the surcharges this past year we're still based on an assessment of the volume that a shipper may have done pre-pandemic, say in February of 2020. Now, while I could understand an argument for that, it may be peak season of 2020, to go back and use that as the gauge in 2021 seems a bit of a stretch. But many of the big carriers were doing that, and the surcharges were significant. Some of the big carriers have stated goals out there now of better, not bigger. And while that's the goal that they have, and by the financial results that they're showing this year, they're certainly achieving it, it hasn't helped the shipper. This current climate of this e-commerce growth, coupled with the restricted capacity, has certainly resulted in a carrier market. Carriers pretty much can state the cost that they want for things and apply surcharges and do other things. And the shippers are really at the mercy, who have this volume to get these orders out, really at the mercy of what the market has there. But there are ways to creatively get around the majority of that and still have a good service and at a reasonable cost. This mitigation strategy to get around this involves developing what we refer to as a diversified niche approach. And the way that this niche approach works, the first thing you need to do is to throw out whatever playbook that you used to have, including utilizing one big carrier for all of your needs. This was the standard go-to for many years, where you'd have one big carrier that would handle all your standard program, handle your express options, handle all your international, and everything else. The one size fits all. That's no longer an approach to use in the current climate, and doing so will be costly in the sense that those big carriers are the ones that have the biggest surcharges right now. But it's also risky. as we found out in later part of 2020 and 2021, risky from the sense of volume throttling as well as severing relationships based on certain programs. So the first steps that you want to do to be able to start to develop a diversified shipping program is to really kind of reverse engineer where it's at and start looking at what kind of service delivery you actually want to achieve with it. You might have, some clients might have the approach that, the delivery time isn't as critical. We want the least expensive program that's out there because we can control the delivery by the cadence with which we release shipments. Others have, goals of having 95% of their parcels delivered in 3 days or less. Whatever it is there, that's the first thing that you need to do is identify what the service levels that you want to achieve are by the client. And those are the services then you need to account for in your program. The next thing you need to do is identify the carriers that can specialize in certain programs or areas. What carriers can provide those kinds of levels of service that it is that you're looking for. You also want to provide redundancy in the offerings as well. You don't want to have just one carrier that can do this one thing because once again, you're probably going to increase costs and you're certainly going to increase risk. By having multiple carriers that can do that allows you the most flexibility and the greatest amount of options in the provision of those services. And once you've done that, then you want to align your shipping matrices to align with your needs and align that with the carriers. Assign those programs, assign those shipments based on the shipment levels to the carriers that can actually deliver that. We call this the 4M's approach that you want to do to enable this. And the first M is to monitor it. Once this program is in place, you want to monitor your transit times, you want to monitor your inductions, you want to monitor your deliveries, and all the aspects of that. And then you want to use that monitored information to manage the network. As time goes by, and particularly in peak times, there may be hotspots to develop with certain carriers. There may be, certain areas that become problematic, and you want to then be able to evolve into taking your next carrier for that and shifting the volume into that. That's what part of the approach is, planning for redundancy in those offerings, where one carrier might struggle with something because of a certain aspect at a certain time. And we've seen a lot of this through peak with the pandemic, with labor and everything else. Another carrier may not be struggling in that area, and we can shift volume into that carrier and still achieve the goals that are needed for the program. And then the third M is to make that known. You want to publish that information out, share that information with your client base so that they can see how the carriers are performing in a state-by-state basis and over the course of time, so that you can work with them to manage the programs as time goes by. As areas of problems are identified, share that information, and then suggest that the shipping program gets altered to meet the needs by using a different carrier for those particular deliveries. The fourth M, and I know everybody's saying, Sean, you said there's 4 M's, but there's only 3 M's there. The fourth M is actually to map it. You want to take your program and lay it out on a map and see if that aligns visually with what the expectation is. Because if it doesn't, some things are going to jump out. And here we have, a map that has one color reflecting certain regional carriers, and another colors covering certain other regional carriers. And then we kind of have a different the interlap of the other carrier that's kind of just filling in all the gaps that maybe something like that doesn't cover. So does it make sense regionally? Does it make sense from a carrier perspective? This is a carrier map here. But another way that you might look at it would be if you have multiple shipping locations to determine then what entry points make sense from a geographic perspective as well. If you're shipping from one location, there's probably not a need to do that because everything is going to go out of one location. But you can mitigate it if you're going out of multiple locations by having your inventory positioned in those different locations and then shipping the goods out to the having the goods fulfilled out of the warehouse that's closest to the recipient. It's going to save you money, it's going to save you time, and it's going to allow for greater flexibility and diversification in your offering. If we take a look at the Ocean X network, for example, that will be in place this year, it's a strategy that's using a certain carrier for expedited air shipments, making sure that that aspect of it is covered by somebody that's very good at that niche offering, using some regional carriers to the east and to the west that have very good delivery times to the regions that they cover, and then filling in the gaps with other national carriers that are a little under the radar, provide very good value of service, and can get the job done. An approach like this can hit 55% of the population in an average time of under 3 days. And you want to also look at employing the same kind of strategy from an international perspective as well. International sales really starting to grow in the e-commerce business, and cross-border shipping continues to grow. So having different kinds of approaches where international carriers specialize in one thing or specialize in another, and matching those to the needs of the program as well, are just as equally important, if not more so now, than the domestic program itself.